Picture this. A naked corpse is bouncing on the back of a pack horse. It's tied down like a slaughtered hog. The head hangs loose, snapping side to side with every step the animal takes. Long hair, once groomed for court, is now clotted with wet mud and fresh blood. A halter is cinched tight around the neck like a leash. And the crowd in Leicester? They aren't mourning. They're cheering. They're laughing, spitting, screaming insults at the skin that was, only hours ago, wrapped in royal velvet. This isn't a thief. This isn't a common criminal. This is King Richard III, the last Plantagenet monarch of England. And this brutal, humiliating parade through the streets is the final scene of the Battle of Bosworth, 1485. In a single afternoon, the course of history snapped in half. But forget the textbooks for a second. Look at the damage on that body. The skull is crushed at the back. Not just cracked, crushed. One halberd strike that didn't simply kill a man. It erased a dynasty. This is what happens when a king loses everything. One moment, you're the most powerful man in Christendom, commanding 12,000 soldiers. The next, you're naked meat on a horse, dragged through town so strangers can mock what used to be sacred. And before we dive into this forgotten story of survival, suffering, and betrayal, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Seriously, it still blows my mind that we're exploring ancient stories together from all over the world, connected across time by the same curiosity. Now, that image of the naked king matters. It wasn't an accident. Richard wasn't stripped because someone wanted his armor. He was stripped because the victors needed a message. They needed to prove the monster was dead. But the real monster wasn't Richard. The real monster was the war itself. Because the Wars of the Roses didn't just fracture England. They turned it into a slaughterhouse. And Bosworth wasn't just another medieval battle. Most battles back then were pushing matches. Two armies shoving each other until someone broke. Bosworth was different. Bosworth was an assassination attempt. It wasn't about taking ground. It was about taking heads. Richard III didn't die hiding. He died leading a suicidal cavalry charge straight at his rival, Henry Tudor. He came within a sword's length of ending the rebellion in one swing. He killed Henry's standard-bearer. He knocked down the giants guarding Henry's position. He fought like a man possessed, because he knew the truth. There is no second place in a Game of Thrones. But he missed. And because he missed, he was hacked to pieces in a marsh. So how did a seasoned warrior with a larger army get outplayed by a math-impaired exile who had never fought a battle in his life? How did 5,000 rebels punch through the iron wall of England's royal army? The answer isn't magic. It's betrayal. It's backroom deals, secret signals, a knife in the back at the exact worst moment. To understand the carnage of that field, we have to stop staring at the body and start looking at the men who put him there. We have to go back to the start of what you might call the winter of blood. The clock is ticking, the invaders are landing, and the king is waking up from a nightmare that's about to become real. Because to understand why a king was hacked to death in a marsh, you need to understand the country he was trying to rule. England in 1485 wasn't some shining land of chivalry. It was a crime scene. For 30 years, the kingdom had been trapped in a cycle of vengeance known as the Wars of the Roses. But strip away the romantic name, and what you've really got is a multi-generational blood feud between two rival branches of the same family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Think of it less like politics and more like a mafia war. If you were born into the wrong side, you didn't just lose your land, you lost your head. By 1485, the timeline is littered with corpses, fathers, brothers, sons. The aristocracy had basically slaughtered itself. There was barely anyone left to kill. And sitting on top of that mountain of skulls was Richard III. Now, Richard is one of history's most complicated figures. He wasn't the cartoon villain Shakespeare wrote to flatter Queen Elizabeth I. He was a capable administrator, a brave soldier, a man who genuinely believed he was saving England from collapse. But he seized the throne in a way that stained his soul. 2 years earlier, when Richard's brother, King Edward IV, died, Richard took custody of Edward's children, the rightful heirs. Then he declared them illegitimate. He took the crown for himself. And then, the boys, the famous princes in the tower, they vanished. Did Richard kill them? We still don't know for sure, but in 1485, everyone believed he did, and that belief was poison. It turned nobles into enemies, commoners into whisperers, the country into a pressure cooker waiting for an explosion. Richard was a king, yes, but he was a lonely king, and while his political world cracked, his personal life collapsed too. In the span of a year, his only legitimate son and heir died. Then his wife, Anne Neville, followed him into the grave. Richard was left childless, widowed, isolated. Chroniclers describe a man who became frantic, barely sleeping, drinking heavily, constantly touching the dagger at his belt like he expected someone to come from behind at any moment. And maybe he wasn't wrong, because Richard knew enemies were circling, not just inside England, but across the Channel. In France, the remnants of the Lancastrian faction were gathering. Richard and his brother had been so efficient at wiping out their rivals, there was almost no one left to challenge the Yorkist claim. Almost. There was one man, a man so obscure, so distant from the throne, that for years nobody bothered to kill him. His name was Henry Tudor. Henry was a ghost. For 14 years he'd lived in exile, drifting from court to court across Europe, always looking over his shoulder for Richard's assassins. He had no money, no army. His claim to the throne was shaky at best, traced through an illegitimate line on his mother's side. In a normal world, Henry Tudor would have been a footnote, a nobody. But Richard's brutality had changed the rules, because Richard had alienated so many powerful families. Men who would never support a Lancastrian suddenly started looking for anyone else. And Henry became the perfect vessel for their hatred. He became the anyone but him candidate. In the summer of 1485, Richard's spies brought him the news he'd been dreading, and maybe, somewhere deep down, secretly expecting. Henry Tudor was done running. He'd secured loans from the French king, who was more than happy to throw England into chaos. He hired mercenaries. Ships were being prepared in Harfleur. Richard moved his headquarters to Nottingham Castle, right in the heart of England, like a spider in the center of a web, waiting for the vibration that would tell him where the fly had landed. He sent out commissions of array, ordering his lords to gather troops. On paper, Richard's force was massive: artillery, heavy cavalry, the full resources of a kingdom. Henry had a few thousand mercenaries and exiles, but Richard had a problem no army could fix. He didn't know who to trust. He held the son of Lord Stanley, the most powerful baron in the Northwest, as a hostage just to guarantee loyalty. He was checking the shadows inside his own war room. That summer, the tension in England was suffocating. People buried their coins, stockpiled grain, watched the weather vanes like prophets. They knew that when the wind shifted, the ships would come. And when the ships came, the fields would turn red again. Then, in early August, the signal fires were lit. Couriers rode hard to Nottingham Castle. Henry Tudor had landed, but not where Richard expected. He didn't strike the south coast to march on London. He landed in the rugged, wild coast of Wales, and the invasion had begun. The winter of blood was about to heat up. For Richard III, the waiting was finally over. If you were a betting man in August of 1485, you wouldn't have put a single penny on Henry Tudor. On the 7th of August, Henry's small fleet scraped onto shore at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire, on the southwest tip of Wales. And I mean scraped. This wasn't a glorious landing with trumpets and banners. It was closer to a smuggling operation. He picked this spot because it was hidden, rugged, and far from Richard's patrols. When Henry stepped onto the wet sand, he knelt and kissed the ground, whispering a prayer. But when he stood up and turned around, he saw his grand army, and it was pathetic. He had about 2,000 men, and these weren't the legendary knights from storybooks. These were the leftovers of Europe. Henry had begged the French court for support, and the French king, Charles VIII, was happy to throw fuel on England's civil war. So he helped Henry by emptying the prisons. Many of Henry's soldiers were released convicts, mercenaries who fought for coin, not loyalty. Scottish wildcards looking for a fight. Men who spoke different languages, wore mismatched gear, and had no emotional reason to risk their lives for an exile they barely knew. And leading them was Henry Tudor, a man with zero battle experience. Meanwhile, waiting on the other side, the entire military machine of England. Richard III could call on tens of thousands of men. He controlled the treasury, the armories, the navy. On paper, this wasn't even a war. It was pest control. But Henry had one secret weapon, not a sword, not a cannon, a name: Tudor. Because Henry wasn't just an English claimant, he was Welsh-born. His grandfather was Welsh, and Henry turned that into psychological warfare. He unfurled the banner of the Red Dragon, the ancient symbol linked to Cadwallader. Then he sent messengers sprinting through the valleys, spreading the rumor that the Mab Darrigan, the son of prophecy, had returned to free Wales. This was a gamble of insane proportions. If the Welsh lords ignored him, he'd be crushed on the beach. If they arrested him to impress Richard, he'd be executed before the week was out. And for the first few days, it looked like the gamble was failing. Henry marched north through mist-shrouded hills, searching for allies. But Wales was silent. The local lords hesitated, watching from behind castle walls. They knew Richard III wasn't a king you casually betrayed. They watched this ragtag column of French convicts and nervous exiles marching past, calculating the odds. Then, the snowball started rolling. The key figure was a powerful Welsh chieftain named Rhys ap Thomas. Rhys had sworn an oath to Richard III that no enemy would enter Wales except over my belly. It was a bold, dramatic way of saying, "I'll die before I let anyone invade for you." Henry needed Rhys. Without him, the invasion was dead. We don't know exactly what was said when the two men met under cover of darkness. Maybe Henry offered him the lieutenancy of Wales. Maybe he appealed to Welsh pride. Maybe he promised wealth. Maybe he promised revenge. But the next morning, Rhys ap Thomas did not lay down his belly for Richard. He joined Henry, and he brought 800 hard-bitten Welsh spearmen with him. Suddenly the 2,000 became 3,000, then 4,000, then more. As Henry pushed deeper inland, the so-called invasion of ghosts started to look like an actual army. They moved with blistering speed, nearly 200 miles in 2 weeks. Henry understood something important. He had to strike before Richard could fully mobilize the northern power base that had made the Yorkists terrifying. But crossing the border into England introduced a new kind of fear. In Wales, Henry could present himself as a liberator. In England? To the average English farmer, Henry wasn't a hero. He was a stranger bringing a horde of French and Scottish outsiders into their country. So Henry issued strict orders. No looting, no stealing, no terror. He needed the English to see him as a king in waiting, not an invader. But by the time word reached Richard III that Henry had crossed the River Severn and entered England, the king was furious. Richard had expected the local lords to stop this rabble at the border. Instead, they'd let him stroll right through the front door. Richard stopped waiting. He summoned his commanders. He put on his armor. The boar, Richard's personal emblem, was coming out to hunt. He declared Henry a traitor, a thief, and a boy of no blood. Then he marched his massive host from Nottingham to Leicester, placing himself like a wall between Henry and London. The game of cat and mouse was over. Henry had nowhere left to run. He'd marched 5,000 men into the throat of the beast. And now, near a small market town called Market Bosworth, the jaws were about to snap shut. August 21st. The sun sinks over the marshlands of Leicestershire. 2 massive camps settle in for the night. They're so close that if the wind shifts just right, you could probably hear the enemy coughing in the dark. On top of Ambion Hill, Richard III holds the high ground. His army looks like a moving city, canvas tents, roaring fires, and 12,000 men sharpening blades. Down in the valley, near the marsh, Henry Tudor's outnumbered soldiers sleep on damp ground. They're outmatched more than 2 to 1. But there's a third army, and this is the key to everything. Hovering between them, refusing to join either camp, are the forces of the Stanley family. Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William command 6,000 men. They're the ultimate wild cards. If they join Richard, Henry is crushed. If they join Henry, the odds even out. So why are they waiting? Because Richard III is holding a knife to their throat. Literally. Richard has taken Stanley's eldest son, Lord Strange, as a hostage, and he sent a message so cold it might as well have been carved in stone. Join the rebels, and your son dies. Stanley is paralyzed. He's survived 30 years of civil war by never committing until the last moment. And now he's playing poker with his son's life as the chips. While the Stanleys stall, Richard tries to sleep, but history tells us his final night was a nightmare. Contemporary chronicles, written by monks who hated him, yes, but who had access to witnesses, describe a night of ghastly visions. Richard didn't rest. He paced his tent until dawn, pale and haggard. Was he haunted by the ghosts of the princes in the tower? Was it the stress of knowing half his army might betray him the moment the fighting starts? Or was it simply the cold realization that 1485 was the end of the line? Meanwhile, Henry Tudor isn't sleeping either, but for a different reason. He's terrified. He knows the math doesn't work. Without the Stanleys, he's walking his friends into slaughter. So in the dead of night, Henry makes a reckless move. He slips out of his camp to meet the Stanleys in secret near the village of Atherstone. It's a desperate meeting, cloaked in shadows. Henry begs. The Stanleys offer vague promises. "We'll be there," they say. But they won't commit. Not while Richard holds the boy. Henry returns before dawn, shaken. No written guarantee, no reinforcements, just a maybe. As the sun rises on August 22nd, a thick mist rolls off the marsh. Visibility is poor. Soldiers wake up damp, cold, hungry. Priests rush through mass. Armor is strapped on, layer upon layer of steel, heavy, suffocating, hot even in the morning chill. Richard emerges from his tent. He looks exhausted, and the chronicles say he mutters a grim line as he stares into the fog. Whoever wins today, England will weep. He orders his army into position, archers and cannons at the front, heavy infantry at the center, cavalry on the wings, an iron wall. He looks down at Henry's small force wading through mud, and it looks like an easy kill. But Richard makes one last check. He turns north. The Stanley army is still there, still watching, not moving, just waiting. The trumpets sound, the cannons roar, some of the earliest gunpowder artillery ever used in an English field battle. Birds explode into the sky. The waiting is over. The Battle of Bosworth has begun. The battle didn't begin with a noble cavalry charge. It began with a roar. Richard's cannons, positioned on the slopes of Ambion Hill, opened fire. Primitive iron beasts coughing smoke and thunder into the morning mist. Stone cannonballs whistled into the rebel ranks. They didn't kill many. Accuracy in 1485 was laughable. But psychologically, it was terrifying. The valley filled with smoke, the smell of sulfur mixed with wet marsh air. And under that cover, Henry's army started to move. But they didn't march in a straight line. They did something smart. Henry Tudor may have never fought a battle, but his commander, the Earl of Oxford, was a genius of medieval warfare. Oxford knew that if his men spread out, Richard's larger force would wrap around them and crush them like an aluminum can. So Oxford ordered his army to tighten, to compress. They formed a dense wedge formation, like a human arrowhead, and instead of charging directly uphill, they shifted around the marsh, using the boggy ground to shield their right flank. It forced Richard's army to fight them on a narrow front. It neutralized the numbers advantage. Suddenly, 12,000 men couldn't fight 5,000. Only the front rows could fight. It became a brawl in a phone booth. When the lines collided, the sound wasn't clean Hollywood swordplay. It was screaming, crunching, the wet thud of bodies hitting mud. Poleaxes slammed into plate armor. Billhooks, basically farm tools turned into killing machines, ripped at helmets and necks. This is the moment where medieval cavalry usually decides the battle. But the marsh made horses useless at first, so it became a grinder. A slow, brutal push where men died face to face, slipping in blood and mud. Up on the hill, Richard watched. He expected his vanguard, led by the Duke of Norfolk, to roll right through Henry's troops. But the rebels weren't breaking. The Oxford wedge held firm, and as the fighting dragged into a brutal stalemate, Richard noticed something deeply wrong. His army had three main parts: the vanguard, the center, and the rear guard. The vanguard was fighting for its life, but the rear guard, thousands of fresh soldiers under the Earl of Northumberland, was just standing there, not advancing, not supporting, not moving. Richard sent orders. Advance! Northumberland didn't. Was it cowardice? Was it terrain? Or was it betrayal? Richard felt the walls closing in. His front line was tiring. His rear guard refused to commit. And the Stanleys were still watching from the sidelines like vultures. In a civil war, a stalemate favors the rebel. Richard knew he couldn't wait for his generals to suddenly grow a spine. He had to break the deadlock himself. Then, He saw it. Through a gap in the melee, Richard spotted a cluster of horsemen behind the rebel lines. They flew the red dragon banner, and beneath it, surrounded by a small bodyguard, sat Henry Tudor. Henry was exposed, too close, and Richard had a sudden, cold realization. He didn't need to defeat the army. He didn't need to win the battle. He just needed to kill one man. If Henry died, the rebellion died with him. Richard tightened his grip on his lance. He signaled his household knights, the finest killers in England. He pointed his sword at the red dragon. This wasn't a general advance. It was a surgical strike, a decapitation blow. Richard slammed his visor shut. The boar was about to charge. The ground began to tremble. At first, it was distant thunder. Then the mud itself started to vibrate. Henry looked up, and what he saw must have stopped his heart. A wedge of about 80 heavy cavalry erupted from the English lines. Leading them was a figure in gleaming armor, wearing a gold circlet over his helmet. Richard III, charging straight at Henry. This wasn't strategy. This was a medieval tank assault. To understand the terror, you have to understand the physics. Richard and his knights rode destriers, massive war horses bred for violence. Horse plus rider plus steel plate armor. That's a projectile weighing over 1,500 pounds, moving at 25 miles per hour. Henry's bodyguards were light infantry and men-at-arms. Pikes, swords, mail, brigandine. Compared to Richard's Milanese plate, they might as well have been wearing cardboard. The collision was catastrophic. Richard's knights slammed into Henry's guard like a runaway train. Men went airborne. Horses screamed. Bones snapped. And in the center of the chaos was Richard. This is where the myth of the crippled hunchback collapses. Richard fought like a demon. He drove his lance directly into Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon. The impact shattered the lance. After it punched through Brandon's chest and killed him instantly. The red dragon banner fell into the mud. Then Richard's charge hit Sir John Cheney, a towering warrior famous for size and strength. Cheney was a giant. But Richard, fueled by desperation, struck him down. Cheney was unhorsed and knocked unconscious. Richard was carving a bloody path straight toward Henry. He had killed the flag-bearer. He had dropped the champion. Now there was almost nothing between the King of England and the pretender. Henry Tudor, who'd spent his life reading books and running from danger, drew his sword. Reports say he was backing away, terrified, as men died around him. He wasn't a warrior. If Richard got within striking distance, Henry was dead. The rebellion ended. The Tudors never existed. Richard was so close he could probably see the fear in Henry's eyes. And he shouted, "Treason! Treason!" as he hacked through the last defenders. He was inches from winning everything. Inches. But history is decided by inches, because just as Richard raised his sword for the killing blow, a horn blast cut through the chaos. Not from Richard's army, not from Henry's, from the side, from the hill where the Stanleys had been waiting. William Stanley's cavalry was finally moving, but they weren't coming to save the king. They were coming to kill him. The arrival of William Stanley changed everything in seconds. Imagine you're in a bar fight, winning against the odds, and then the bouncer steps in, not to stop it, but to smash a bottle over your head. That's what happened to Richard III. Stanley's fresh cavalry didn't join the main clash. They slammed directly into the flank of Richard's isolated charge group. It was a massacre. Richard's knights had been focused entirely on Henry. Now they were blindsided. The momentum flipped instantly. Richard went from hunter to hunted. His elite wedge was swallowed by sheer mass. Men were dragged from saddles and stabbed in the mud. The king's banner disappeared under hooves. And in that moment, realizing the depth of betrayal, Richard screamed again, "Treason! Treason! Treason!" He wasn't just cursing William Stanley, he was screaming at the universe. He had been right. The paranoia wasn't madness, it was instinct, and the knife had finally found his back. Then Richard's horse, a white courser, lost footing in the marsh. The king was thrown. Now he was on foot, ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by thousands of enemies. This was the moment to flee. One of Richard's companions brought him a fresh horse, begged him to mount up. The path to the rear was still barely open. Richard could have escaped. He could have regrouped. He could have survived. But Richard III refused. Chroniclers say he pushed the reins away and declared, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will die King of England." Whatever you believe about Richard, villain, victim, child killer, misunderstood ruler, you have to respect the raw grit of that choice. He knew he was going to die, and he chose to make them earn it. He swung his sword until his arms burned. He fought alone now, the last man standing in a tightening circle. Welsh pikemen, French mercenaries, Stanley's cavalry. Everyone wanted the glory of killing a king. And cornered animals fight the hardest. Richard fought like a man possessed. But bravery can't beat physics. There were too many. A halberd hook snagged his helmet. A dagger found a gap in his armor. The king went down. And once he hit the ground, chivalry ended. Butchery began. For 500 years, how Richard died was legend. Poets wrote about it. Painters imagined it. But nobody knew the truth until 2012. Archaeologists dug under a parking lot in Leicester and found a skeleton with a curved spine. They called it Skeleton 1. We know it as Richard. And modern forensics gave us something no chronicler could. The final 3 seconds of his life. The skeleton revealed 11 wounds near the time of death. But here's the chilling part. 9 were to the skull. That means at some point, Richard lost his helmet. Maybe the strap was cut. Maybe it was ripped away. But once that steel shell was gone, he was doomed. The bones show smaller cuts across the top of the head, glancing blows from swords and daggers, men trying to slip past his guard. But those didn't kill him. The killing blows came from behind. The base of his skull shows 2 massive trauma wounds, not from swords, from a heavy-bladed polearm, likely a halberd. A 6-foot weapon topped with an axe blade, spike, and hammer. It generates terrifying leverage. Forensic experts believe Richard was likely on his knees, stunned, trapped, maybe held down. An attacker above and behind him swung downward. The blade sheared through the base of the skull and into the brain. Instant lights out. No final speech. No dramatic curse. Just a violent switch to black. But the violence didn't stop there. The skeleton shows humiliation wounds. A cut on the jaw. Broken ribs from armor being ripped off. And most disturbingly, a wound to the pelvic bone, inflicted through the right buttock. Experts believe it happened after he was dead. An insult, a final desecration. Remember the naked body on the pack horse? That wound likely happened during that parade. That's medieval regicide. Not noble, not clean, a frenzy. A king reduced to meat for mercenaries to carve. With Richard dead, the chaos on the field began to settle. The news spread like wildfire. "The boar is fallen! The boar is fallen!" Men dropped weapons. The roaring violence collapsed into exhausted silence, broken only by the groans of the dying. The king was dead. Long live the king. But where was the crown? Amid the wreckage, a soldier spotted something glinting beneath a hawthorn bush. A battered gold circlet, the crown of England, knocked from Richard's helmet in the fight. It was brought to Lord Stanley, the very man who betrayed Richard. Stanley walked to Henry Tudor and placed the circlet on his head. And surrounded by corpses, the army roared, "God save King Henry!" It sounds like storybook destiny. But the reality was cold calculation. This was the end of the Plantagenets, 300 years of rule extinguished in one afternoon. Henry Tudor was now King Henry VII, and his first move as king was pure political genius. He declared his reign began on August 21st, 1485, the day before the battle. Think about what that meant. By backdating his reign, Henry legally turned Richard III and every soldier who fought for him into traitors. Not loyalists, traitors. So Henry could seize their lands, execute leaders, and refill his treasury with their wealth. Ruthless, effective, the Tudor way. To end the wars for good, Henry married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. Lancaster and York united. The red rose and white rose merged into one symbol, the Tudor rose. But Henry's most powerful weapon wasn't marriage or law. It was ink. He knew he'd won through violence. So he hired writers and historians to justify it. They painted Richard as a monster. They exaggerated his scoliosis into a grotesque hunchback. They piled crimes onto his name, some true, some invented. They turned him into the villain so Henry could be the savior. And it worked. For 500 years, that story lasted. It gave us Shakespeare. It gave us the evil uncle image. It buried the real Richard under propaganda. Just like his body was buried in a hurried grave at Greyfriars Friary. The Tudor dynasty born that day would produce Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It would reshape England into a global power. But the foundation of their golden age was built on Bosworth mud, on Stanley betrayal, on a crushed skull in a marsh. As the sun set on August 22nd, 1485, the medieval world was dying. The age of knights was fading. The age of gunpowder, bureaucracy, and absolute monarchy was beginning. Richard's story was supposed to end there, forgotten. But history has a way of clawing back to the surface. For centuries, Richard's grave was lost. Rumors said his body had been tossed into the River Soar. It seemed fitting. The monster washed away by time. Then, in August 2012, exactly 527 years after Bosworth, a team led by Philippa Langley broke ground in a city council parking lot in Leicester. They were looking for Greyfriars Church ruins. On the first day, they found human leg bones. As they uncovered the skeleton, the spine was curved. Severe scoliosis. Not Shakespeare's exaggerated hunchback, but real. And the skull bore battle scars, deep slices, dagger marks. DNA confirmed the impossible. Skeleton 1 was Richard III. The last Plantagenet king had spent 5 centuries under tarmac, beneath a reserved parking spot marked R. The discovery changed everything. It peeled away Tudor propaganda. It forced us to see not a monster, but a man. A man with a painful spinal condition who still trained as a warrior. A man surrounded by enemies who refused to run. A man brutally murdered and humiliated in death. In 2015, Richard finally received the funeral he was denied in 1485. Thousands lined the streets of Leicester, not to jeer, but to toss white roses onto the coffin of a king. He was reburied in Leicester Cathedral with royal honors. and the story of Bosworth becomes more than military analysis. It becomes a lesson about truth. History is written by victors, yes. Henry Tudor wrote the books. But history is also written in the earth, in DNA, in bones. And sometimes, if we dig deep enough, the earth speaks back. Bosworth was the end of the Middle Ages, a tragedy of ambition, betrayal, and violence. But now, looking back, we can finally see clearly. We can see the courage of the charge, the cold calculation of betrayal. And we can finally give the king in the car park the one thing he fought for, but never received in his lifetime: fairness. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal battles, subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got many more stories of forgotten kings and ancient mysteries coming, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Was Richard III a villain or a victim of his time? Was the Stanley betrayal justified to end the war? Let's discuss it down below. The king is dead. But thanks to science, and thanks to curiosity, the truth is finally alive.